last thing I need. All right, go to Matthew chapter 25, verse 14. And I made a promise. I may not stick to it. Just kidding. Just kidding. We'll see what happens. We finished this morning verses 1 through 13, and you all don't believe in miracles, should now. Right? That's a good thing. We're in chapter 25, verse 14. And again, by way of introduction, one thing, I'll put this slide on next. We are not covering any of that except one verse this morning. So I already took 13 verses, okay? Praise God. Nobody? And then this second class, we're going to do one verse, and or actually one phrase. We'll see why. So to introduce this part of the chapter, again, it's an illustration of what he's already said in the parable in chapter 32, chapter 24, verse 32. I'll be all right. I did have chocolate, though. Does that count? A little bit of caffeine. Anyway, we're looking at what people are supposed to be doing while they're waiting for his return. What is the preparation? He talks to them about being on alert, being prepared, being wise, being faithful, be ready. All those things. It's almost like a Christian scout motto, right? Be ready. Anyway, the illustration of his talents is about what the slave is to do with his possessions given to him while the man, or master in this case, is away on a journey. Again, once again, a reminder. Context is king. We have to understand the context of what this is happening. Who is this illustration given to? Because this is also the important idea behind it. And we know that Matthew is about the Jewish nation coming to the Lord, understanding Jesus is their king. That's what we've been teaching. I don't know how many years we've been doing this so far. Please don't tell me. It'll just make me older, but we're almost done now. So when we talk about this, you have to understand this is talents. It's not about a talent. What did that guy used to say, Rush Limbaugh? It's not about a talent on loan from God. It's about real money, real talents given, real things, and it's an expression of what you are going to do, what God has given you during that tribulation time. It's not about the church. It's not about the church life or church coming. It's not about any spiritual gift or about the price of eggs at Walmart, just in case you want to know. It's about those who are on alert and the qualities they exhibit at the time of the tribulation, and at the end they will be called, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And this all stems again from the understanding that he is coming, is near, his parousia is near. Now, I said in the first class, this is not a parable. And I believe it's not, but it's tied intimately to the parable. So what he's doing is he's given a parable in chapter 24, verse 32, and everything else is kind of an elucidation to that parable, tied to it. So even though it's not a parable per se, it's part of the parable. We okay so far? I don't want to confuse anybody. However, parable as a genre, it's very hard to use that to interpret something else. It's a genre in itself, and just read it. It's an illustration. Everything in a parable doesn't mean something. So you can't put there's 10 characters in a parable and say each 10 represent this. Sometimes it's just there for color, telling a story. So what I want to first explain is verse 30, however, because verse 30 is an illustration of what happens to the outcome of those talents and how one doesn't use it at all. And I'm going to say this, my point this morning is basically, if I was titling this as a titled sermon, judgment's coming. And Matthew's pretty strong about that. So let's look at the one verse I want to kind of cover. And we're going to spend some time in this. The reason I'm doing this, because when I get to it, to go back would be kind of interesting. But I want to know, this is kind of like the Paul Harvey moment. I'm going to tell you the end of the story. Then I'll tell you the story, okay? So here's what 25:30 says. Throw out the worthless slave into outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I'm going to say something. I was brought up in an understanding that's very simple. If it makes sense, as you're reading it, seek no other sense. You kind of go, is this clear by reading? Who thinks this has anything to do with bad Christians? Oh, good. Because there are people out there today in our doctrinal distinctions that believe that. The problem I have is, number one, it's not about I just said that. See? Very good. One was listening, the rest of you failed. No, just kidding. It's not about the church, so how can we insert the church here, all of a sudden insert the church? It's just a bad way to do any kind of interpretation. And they do that on all these appearances. It's not the first appearance. We're going to talk about them all. We're going to walk through every appearance in 45 minutes, hopefully. So first of all, judgment's coming. In 2 Peter 2:4, it says, for if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, now we're not going to talk about that topic right now, but I want to talk about what's highlighted in red, and cast them into hell, cast. I want you to get a lot of these words are so the same words, the same understanding. If you don't know what cast means, it's not going out fishing and casting, which is kind of the idea. It's basically picking up by the scruff of his neck and throwing him out. Very, very strong idea of throwing him out. So it's cast into hell. Is that for believers? Please say no in unison. Believers do not go to hell. And committed them to the pits of what? Darkness, reserved for judgment. So let's talk about various things that come out of these verses. And again, I'm not going to obscure teaching. I'm going in-house. I've been associated with different kind of groups, and I stopped that a long time ago. So somebody says, do you follow such and such? Somebody once walked in here and said, are you part of the free grace movement? I go, grace is free. That's what the word means. To say free grace is kind of redundant, and no, I'm not. I do believe grace is free. So don't say, oh, you don't belong to them, so you don't believe grace is free any longer. No, I believe grace is grace. I don't need to be part of a group that has a lot of understandings I don't agree with. So I'm going to give you some of those, okay, this morning. I've gotten most of these. Some I've had for a long time, and most of them I was close with Dennis Roxer. If you want a really good book, he wrote a book, Should You Be Afraid of Outer Darkness? I think it's called, something like that. But in his book, he has these quotes. The first quote we're going to look at this morning is J.D. Faust. May or may not heard of him. Doesn't matter. I'm just showing you. I'm quoting from somebody. At the judgment seat of Christ, unfaithful Christians will lose entrance into the millennial kingdom and will be banished for 1,000 years. To where? To where? And in order for him to cover where that is, because remember, we've been talking already. There's a group that goes into the kingdom, right? And there's a group that does what? Doesn't get into the kingdom and is cast out, and we know that's hell. So there's only two groups we've been talking about, and we're going to talk about two groups in chapter 25, 14 through 30 also. But for him to say that, I'm saying, your theology a miss. Now, I'm going to say this as clearly as I possibly can, and there's enough scriptural evidence. If you're a believer here this morning, you will not experience the wrath of God, and you will not be punished. The only thing a believer can do is get rewards or lose rewards. That's it. That's before the judgment seat of Christ. I did a whole teaching on that. I don't know if it's on the internet or if it's all on the internet, whether it's on a website or whether it's on, which I am affectionately calling YouTube. I'm taking ownership. Second one is Gary T. Whipple. He says, those that stand before the judgment seat with lost souls. So I don't know what judgment seat he's talking about, because there's a judgment seat of Christ, which is not for lost. The great white throne judgment is not for the believers. Okay? Though they be heirs of the Father, will be disinherited from being joint heir with Christ, lose all rewards forever, and not be glorified with him during the 1,000-year reign. What are you saying? First time I ever saw that, I said, you got to be kidding. And you believe some of the things I do? No, you don't. You don't believe anything I do, because coming out of this, which will matriculate into really bad theology. And I want to make sure you all understand I'm quoting from people I don't agree with. Okay? Chuck Missler, some of you may or may not have heard of him. It says, this does not speak of hell, nor is it a place where unbelievers go. And it's the place where the unfaithful and disobedient believers will dwell during the millennium while they learn sanctification. I wish this was a typo. It's a separate place, another room, what? Or region outside the light of the presence of the Lord. What is he talking about? Now, I'll be honest, if I was in any of these guys' congregations or a part of what they're doing, I would leave. I have no time. My time is precious and good doctrine is necessary. How about this one? Jody Dillow, I've had his book for years. I'm not sure what to do with it. When I first read most of it, I was seriously upset. And this was I'm going to say this loosely, the Bible of a lot of people. Jody had this market locked up. They loved it. It's one of the best-selling books of its time. And then he did something. He updated it and made another one. I don't know what it's called, but I did not decide to use any of my money to buy it. One day I'll decide what to do with this. I'm thinking one day I'll have a bonfire for bad books, because the ones I've already accumulated would make a large fire. Here's what he says in The Reign of the Servant King, and I have actually, because this is what I found in page 351, the phrase wailing and gnashing of teeth is found 7 times in the New Testament. I'm with him so far. Okay, cranking. Even though it is used 3 occasions of the experience of the unregenerate in hell, it is used 4 occasions for the regenerate in the kingdom. What? That's called horrible Bible exegesis, right? He just read his thoughts into something he just wants to make fit. And if you notice, he starts with Matthew 13, 42 and 50, goes to Luke 13, 28, which is a totally different context, but the context here fits right in here. So you either got to take these verses and put them up to that, or stop thinking silly thoughts. However, he goes on. The notions of heaven or hell are simply not part of the semantic range of the words. I don't know what dictionary he's using. He should throw them out. And again, context defines a word, not a dictionary. Okay? The fact that non-believers can experience profound regret in hell is no way implies that true Christian cannot experience profound regret in the kingdom. There will be no remorse in heaven. So he's separating kingdom and heaven ideas. I go, what are you doing? But I wish it was over, so I'm going to add to the pain. He's got a couple more slides. We are repeatedly told that when the Lord comes, he will reward us good and bad, and that some may draw back in shame at his coming. Some Christians are going to be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. You see what he's doing? This is called horrible exegesis. He's mixing and melding verses and ideas that don't go together. And you've got to fact check. These are all fallacies. There are all good verses, just taken out of context to fit his context. So a pretext and a context make for bad what? Theology. Okay? It gets worse. It seems that these verses are adequately explain the experience of profound regret of an unfaithful Christian, which Matthew calls wailing and gnashing of teeth. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. You are not going to have regret. You will be confronted with what you did, with what you had, and God will reward you or not. That's not a time of regret and wrath and so on and so forth. How about this from Charles Stanley? Let's leave no stone unturned. Gnashing of teeth does not symbolize pain, as many have thought, instead deep regret. I don't know how you can get that. Because when I have deep regret, I usually say it's sorrow or whatever. If you just read it, weeping and gnashing of teeth does not sound good. Others that hold this view include Tony Evans, but I don't know if he's camped with us at all at any point. Charles Bing, which I was super surprised about. Kenneth Dodson, Ken Wilson, to name a few. And that's all I've done. It's kind of, yes, I'm naming people, which I usually don't do. But the problem I have with this is how many people will believe a book written by a solid believer that we would think is a solid believer and not verify and fact check with this book. So I'm here to do the work for you this morning, okay? And we're going to do that because the reason is I want you to understand as a believer, you are going to either go into rapture, which is going to be first, or you're going to die, go to heaven, and be present with the Lord, absent from the body, present with the Lord. Paul doesn't interrupt that and said, by the way, you may not have that happen. You may be cast into a place, there's absence of God, and it's dark, and you're going to have regret. And to me, I'm thinking, isn't that hell? I don't know what else that is. I mean, this is the only hell I want to experience here. Okay? And if there's time for punitive damages to me, Christ took it. Okay? So, how many times is this phrase or types of this phrase used in the New Testament? That's a good question. We should ask that. And then we're going to go through some keys to unlock that. So this phrase that we're looking at is only used in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, there's one similar to it. In Luke, it's similar, but the context is totally different, however. So it doesn't fit. It's just talking about weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's all he says in Luke 13:28. Feel free to look it up. I'm not going to cover it at all this morning. But I'll give you the passages because we're going to walk through every one of them, and we probably won't get done this morning. I know that because it's kind of tedious because what we're doing is reviewing what we've already taught in the passages, but quickly because I want you to get something these guys don't do is get the context and what's going on. So it's Matthew 8:12, Matthew 13:42 and verse 50, 22:13, 24:51, 25:30. Now, most people that have looked at the Gospel of Matthew, from my understanding, and if you didn't get those, we're going to go through them, so just wait. We're going to go through every one of these. That believed that after Matthew chapter 12, the nation had rejected their Messiah Jesus, and after that, it was all just about coming judgments and things like that. And I said, well, I agree with that, but I disagree with that. Until Christ was put on the cross, they all had an opportunity, and Jesus gives them that opportunity to become believers. But as a nation, when Jesus fully judges the Pharisees and scribes and Pharisees and called them hypocrites, his judgment was cast upon the nation by their leaders. They were not, as a nation, going to be saved, which would usher in the kingdom. Okay? So that is truly there, at least by Matthew chapter 23. So let's talk about some keys we needed to unlock this phrase and what Jesus is clearly telling the hearers. Okay? First of all, key number one. All these terms are used in the book of Matthew. That should set off every alarm. Matthew is not about the church. Is that not clear enough right there? So these verses have nothing to do with believers today, period. Nothing. Zero. Nada, in case you speak another language. What is it? Nil, zilch, whatever else. Listen, it's so important. When you study the Bible, remember who a book is written to. Are there applications to those people? Absolutely. Is there implications for us? Sure. But if you go directly from Matthew and what Matthew says to the church, you're doing eisegesis that doesn't work. You're putting something in that's not part of the context. Second key, Jesus talks of hell more than anyone else in the Bible. Ooh. When I was a kid, if you said hell in church, it was, wow, you shouldn't be saying that kind of word. But Jesus said it. It's not a curse word. It's a place. Write this down in your brain or in your notes. Hell is an actual place. It's a place. He says it in Matthew 5:22, 29, 30, 10:28 to 18:9, 22:15, 33. Elsewhere, he says it in Mark 9:43, 45, 47. Luke 12:5, James refers to hell, and Peter, we just read the verse from Peter. So hell is mentioned by Jesus, and it's a real place, and I think it's not a good place, and many kids when I was younger tried to send you there. It wasn't their option, but they would say that, right? Okay? But they didn't have any. So those are all the I didn't know I had them up there. Okay, fourthly, terms that appear alongside outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth. Here's the things that come alongside it with it. So we got to get, what do we get? We talked about context, the book. We're going to talk about immediate context. It says in that place. I believe the King James doesn't use that, or other versions, it just is there. And that word there is basically means in that place. So NASB did one more step of interpretation. And being in that place, it's not figurative. It is real. And saying in that place means it's a location. It's a place. Now, it's not going to have a physical address like we have on earth, but it's a place. Where it is, I don't know. And part of me knows that it's going to be created for, it's going to be initiated for Satan and his demons. But those that go to hell are not, it's never meant for them. But by not being ready, that's where they'll end up. By not being a believer, that's where they'll end up. I know that. It's in the Bible. And I can't make it fit anybody that's a believer. Being put in that kind of torment or anguish. I don't know about you. Weeping and gnashing of teeth is usually not a good day for me. Yeah, anybody? Well, weeping. I don't, gnashing of teeth. My dentist says I grind my teeth. I go, I stopped that years ago. He goes, you did damage. But just think about what grinding of teeth means. It means you're really in anguish, right? Just a simple idea behind it. Secondly, that's under, I don't have this. Okay, in that place. Secondly, in every context, some enter in and others don't. There's a group that goes in to the kingdom, and it can't be a third group. Where's the third group? Those that don't go in but kind of get, what would we call that? Protestant purgatory? I don't know what else to call that. And there is no place, first of all, I'm not a Catholic, never been a Catholic. I've been by Catholic churches and I played on Catholic grounds, but I've never been a Catholic. And the Catholic doctrine of purgatory just drives me a little batty. You know, it's horrible. But this is just as bad because it's Protestant. Where are you going? There's not a third group ever mentioned. And then some were cast out. And I always get the vision of the bouncer in a bar picking up a little guy who's a little obnoxious and him throwing him through those saloon doors and as he tosses him out and says, "Don't you come in." So it's pretty aggressive terms, and I don't think the bouncer, who would be God in this case, would do that to a believer. Do you? I mean, just think about it. Where would you find that? How often has Paul mentioned that a believer will be in outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth? Because I'm going to tell you something. Southern Baptists love to find certain things to really get you all convicted. But I'll get you convicted. If you're not a believer today, you will be cast out in the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that's not for 1,000 years. That's for an eternity, forever. That's what the Bible says. So we're going to look at various verses in Matthew that hold this to gain context. And this may be a little tedious, but I think at the end of the day, you'll see where at least I'm going with this. So let's begin in Matthew chapter 8, verse 12. So you can turn in your Bibles. I'm going to try and walk through these as quickly as I can and simply as I can. This will be probably the easiest. So we're dealing with in Matthew chapter, I got it up here. We could do this. We're dealing in Matthew chapter 8 with a very interesting kind. This is, again, the first use in first use in Matthew, first use in the New Testament, and it's only used in Matthew. In verse 12, we'll just look at let's do this. Verse 1 says, verse 5. And when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, entreating him, and says, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering great pain." And he said to him, "I will come and heal him." And the centurion answered and said, "Lord, I am not worthy of you, for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed." So what did this centurion already know? The centurion knew he had a servant who was laying paralyzed, and that Jesus was the one who could heal him. Okay? So drop down. We're not going to go through dissect the whole thing. We'll let your eyes drop down to verse 10. And when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those following him were all Jewish by nature. And he says, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. What's the concept here? Faith. He truly understood that he didn't have to be there. Jesus would heal his servant and take care of it and get done. And he had faith. So then he says in verse 11, I say to you, many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Just so you know what it means, people who are not Jewish will come to the feast that's headed by Jews. Jesus is a Jew, okay? Sorry, anybody else that thinks he's not a Jew. He's a Jew. And his birthright was from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's important because he wasn't just son of Abraham, nor Abraham and Isaac, because that wouldn't make him a full Jew. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob makes you Jewish. So go through the whole Old Testament. When they say that, it's talking about the Jewish people. So in verse 12, it says, but the sons of the kingdom. Now, this is kind of strange because, again, in context, he's saying those in the kingdom that do not have faith, that's what he's already said in a couple of verses before that. Those that do not have faith in the kingdom will be cast into outer darkness. In that place, look at all the key words. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it's good for us to see that idea. They will be carried out into that place. They will be cast out. This word in the Bible, the idea of cast out, is kind of interesting. It has to do with casting out demons. Casting out a tenant from a property they've rented. You want them out. What do? Cast them out. To send out. Sometimes it's with violence. It's a violent expulsion. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to destroy them, but it's forcibly getting them out. And sometimes it's used without any kind of violence. So that we have the coming kingdom coming. Jesus has promised that kingdom. There are those that are cast out, and we know from the context they are not believers, but believers enter the light of the kingdom. Darkness says they're not in the kingdom. Light, we've already did this earlier in chapter 24, when we talked about the glory of the Lord there. It is full light. It is glorious light. If you're not in the kingdom, you're going to have not as glorious light. It's darkness. So here's what we have. In verse 13, we know verse 10, we know that he had great faith. He was a believer, and he believed, had great faith. Verse 13 says this. Let's just capsulize it and we'll go backwards. Jesus said to the centurion, go your way. Let it be done to you as you have believed. Fascinating understanding in the text grammar. It's the aorist, active, indicative. For himself, individually, he believed. He believed. It was as an aorist, it was an event. It was an occasion that he came to belief, and it's a fact. And that's at that moment when Jesus said that, he knew his servant was healed. And that's important to see that. So we have in this short vignette here in chapter 8, what do we have? We have believers and not believers. Some of them, and as we've looked, some of them will sit at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They'll feast. What is that? We talked about it earlier in the first class. That'll be the wedding feast. There'll be a phenomenal feast, a wedding banquet, and they'll sit with them at the banquet, and the others will not. They'll be cast out. Again, 2 places. Where's the third place, just in case you believe they're outer darkness for believers? Where is it? There's only 2 places mentioned, right? Okay, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So, next one, Matthew 13:42. Matthew 13:42. Now, as we go to this, what I want you to see very clearly, 13. We're going to start in verse. Let's see where I want to pick up. I'm just going to briefly go through different places and you can see where we're going to start. We're going to start in verse 36. But just so you know, this is the chapter on parables, right? Where are we at in chapter 25? We're on a discussion of a parable, right? So in verse 24, he says, He presented him another parable, verse 31. He says, and he presented another parable, verse 33. He spoke another parable. So these are a lot of parables, all about the kingdom of what? Heaven. So in verse 36, when he left the multitudes and went into the house, his disciples came to him and says, explain to us the parable of the tares. Who's he talking to? He's talking specifically to his disciples that are going to get a further understanding because they're not too sure about what this parable means. So here's what's needed. It's talking about the tares in the field, and parables are not meant to basically interpret other parables, interpret other scriptures. Parables are not meant to build doctrines on, but they're to illustrate doctrines, illustrate Jesus' teaching. So in verse 37, it talks about, and he answered them and said, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. That's pretty good. He's helping us understand what's going on in the parable. Who is the sower of seeds? Jesus. Jesus is the sower of good seeds. Well, who are the good seeds? Verse 38 says, the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. Now, he's using the same terminology just used in a negative sense because of the context. Context is different now. He's talking about the good seed are those that are in the kingdom who are believers. And then he says the tares are the sons of the evil one. How many kinds of people are there? 2. Okay. Just making sure you see that. We talk about that, and he says the harvest. He goes on in verse 39. He says, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age. That's the same phrase in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. What did it tell us? The signs of the end of the age, the consummation of the age. So we've got these similar vignettes saying the same things, just different ways. You know, best way to teach, say the same thing a bunch of times, different ways. And sometimes students, I got it now. So Jesus is a really good teacher. And the reapers are the angels. So we have a time of harvest where there's going to be a time to bring in the good seed. And those that bring it in are the angels. And that's all happened. Therefore, verse 40 says, and as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire. What is he talking about? Is that something good? Burn with fire, getting rid of them. So it shall be at the consummation of the age. He's talking about the end of the age. Same thing. Okay? I don't see how we can't all get that. So we've got that heads up moment and understand that. Verse 41 says, the Son of Man will send forth his angels. Jesus will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness. So as the kingdom's beginning, he's going to thresh the floor. He's going to separate. Here's wheat and tares, good seed and tares. Okay? And all the unrighteous will be gathered out of the kingdom, who are the offenders who's practicing these, and they're practicing continuously, basically lawlessness. They're unrighteous. They don't have the righteousness that God has given to the believers. And then it says in verse 42, and just so you know, it's connected, that group that is already being gathered together for the fire by the angels is going to be an added understanding. They will be cast them into the furnace of fire. This is why I say there's a problem with people taking a phrase that's connected to another phrase already in the context of a book and saying, well, that's only about hell. The other ones aren't, because it has that added context. So when Jody Dillow says that this is about hell, he's right. It's about hell, but the terminology is all the same. Notice he says they will be cast. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Add to that, what is that place going to be like? It's a furnace of fire. Why? Because hell is the furnace of fire. It's not a place for believers that are not so good to spend 1,000 years in that darkness. It says clearly 2 groups of people, 2 places, and this place is pretty bad. And it's reserved for them. I think it's interesting because this is what it says in verse 43. Comparatively, then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of the Father. Whose kingdom is it? The Father's. Who's going to rule it? The Son. And we've already had the marriage motif in the first class. So it kind of all fits perfectly together, right? least I think so. He who has ears, let him hear. Please listen up. There's only one or two groups you could possibly be in. And it's important to see that. And I think a good listen up is important. But notice that the righteous will shine forth. So when we talked about the kingdom and Jesus' glory being there and the extreme light that it'll be, believers will be like beacons reflecting that light. The righteous will be, just think how brilliant and bright the place will be. What's outer darkness? Absence of all that. It's as simple as that. Next one, 1350. 1350. Let's just put up there for nice looks. 1350, but again, context. Let's start in verse 47. It says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like. It's still parabolic language. Guys see that? A dragnet cast into the sea and gathering fish of every kind. And when it is filled, they will draw it to the beach and they will sat down and gather the good. Fish is added, but we're talking about good fish in the containers. And the bad, what do they do with? Chuck them. So will be, listen, so will be when? At the consummation of this age into another age. That's what we discussed way back in Matthew, the beginning of Matthew 24, that when the age of the tribulation ends, is really ending that time period, bringing into another. So we're talking about ushering in the kingdom. The tribulation has to usher in the kingdom. And that's what it's talking about. And angels shall come forth. What are the angels? We've already seen that. Angels are the what? The reapers. Now that's context because we're all in the same part. We just skipped a few verses to go here. And the angels shall come forth and take the what from among the righteous? The wicked. There's how many groups of people are there? Two. Wicked and righteous. And they will cast them, those wicked, they will cast them into the furnace of fire. Where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then he says something very interesting that most people don't. Have you understood all these things? Have you gotten? They're all connected. Jesus gave us a great way to understand how to interpret this passage. They're all connected. Have you understood all these things? They're interconnected. This is what the kingdom will be like. And the disciples said, yes. And I honestly can't read into what that yes was. Yes, we do, because we want to answer this, because we want to look stupid. Or yes, we partially get it. But here's what the disciples get more than anybody else. He is constantly teaching them. So if they say, oh, by the way, we haven't seen the Father. Can you show us the Father? And Jesus said, where have you been for 3 years, Philip? Wake up, son. Class has begun. Okay. Next one, Matthew 22. Matthew 22. Matthew 22, because it kind of brings us to another place. That's kind of interesting. What is that? Oh, what's there? Okay, why is it twice? I had a hiccup. Okay, we're focused. Just trying to figure out why I did it twice. Verse 1 says something very interesting. Jesus answered and spoke to them again in parables. So when you have parabolic language, understand it's parabolic language. Also understand parabolic language is not necessarily to anybody, but specifically who Jesus is addressing. I love when people take Matthew 13 and says, this is for the church, and interpret it for the church. And there's so many horrible issues with that, to do that. But also, notice this, who's he speaking to? He says in verse 22, and Jesus answered and spoke to them. Who's the them? Okay? So it's really good to look at context, right? We say disciples, because that's what, no. Look back a few verses. Verse 45. Because here's the problem. When we study scriptures, for some reason, chapter breaks kind of like a roadblock. Okay, we got to stop that thought because we're going to a new chapter. So no, don't do that. If you take a Hebrew text or a Greek text, it's all one. There's no chapter breaks until somebody put them in there. As a matter of fact, original Hebrew didn't even have vowel pointing. Go read something that's all consonants. That'll make your eyes flip and roll, right? But you can. I bet you if you put up I don't know if you can do this on any processor, write a story and take out the vowels, and you probably could read it, because we've been so familiar with words. That's not the point. The point is verse 45 of 21 says, and when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. They took it personal. Good job. It was personal. And when they sought to seize him, they feared the multitudes because they held him to be a prophet. So Jesus is a prophet of the nation of Israel. That's what they're looking at. And the Pharisees are under the indictment of these parables. And guess what? He's going to give them another one. This is kind of like the double barrel idea here. Now, I want you to understand something. 21:32 also sets this up, because verse 32 says this. For John came to you in a way of righteousness, and you did not what? What did you do? You didn't believe him. Chapter 21, verse 32 says he didn't believe him. And the tax gatherers and harlots did believe him. And you, seeing this, did not even feel remorse afterward so as to believe him. So how many groups of people are there? Say it, two. There's two groups. There's those that believed and those that don't. And we're still sitting in that same idea that's happening here. Verse 2. 22 verse 2. The kingdom may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast to his son. Does it help you with what we did this morning? Here comes the bride kind of idea. So it's a wedding motif. Verse 3 says, and he sent out his slave to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Not only were they not spiritually prepared, not ready, they didn't want to come. Verses 4 through 6. And again, he sent other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen, and my fattened livestock, and all butchered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his own business. In other words, they just went back to work. Did their jobs, didn't care. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated and killed them. That's not good stuff. They paid no attention. They even did the same thing they had done to the prophets to these people. They had seized them and killed them. Verse 7 and 8 says, but the king was enraged, sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set the city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. How are they not worthy? They didn't believe. They were unwilling to come. They were not prepared. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding feast. So the invitation goes out to the world. Go, come to the wedding feast. And those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together, and all they found, both evil and good. And the wedding, in other words, he's saying there is that there's two kinds of people in the world, evil and good. What do they have to do to become ready? Is to believe. Okay? And the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. And then the king came in, and this is where you have to get the wedding motif in your mind. The king came in, took a look over at the dinner guests, and he saw there was a man not dressed in wedding clothes. Wow. He wasn't what? Ready. How do you get ready? Which is kind of an interesting thing, because he shows up at the wedding and this guy's got none of the wedding clothes on, and the father of the groom would prepare these festive garments for people to wear at the wedding. And again, in culture of the time, the king would provide the wedding guests with garments that's appropriate to wear. But to not have a garment means that you have refused what the king has willfully provided for you. All you had to do was what? Accept it. Put it on. What do we have to do? Today, Paul talks about putting on Christ. How do you do that? Believe, okay? There's similar things going on. They're not the same here. God gives you his son's righteousness at the moment of salvation, and we now know it as putting on Christ. That's not what's happening here, but the king has provided for this nation. The feast, they've come to the feast. This guy, now he's indicative of many. Just say, oh, there's one that showed up like this, but it's many. he came up, who did he come with? If he didn't come with the king's righteousness, he came with his what? His own righteousness. How powerful is that? Many people think they can stand before God and say, I'm good enough to be here. And God says, no, I never knew you. And that's important. Then in verse 12, he says, and he said to him, friend, how did you come here without wedding clothes? And he was speechless. See, basically he says, now the word friend here doesn't mean I have a relationship with you. He calls Judas his friend later. I don't know what kind of relationship he had with Judas, other than duck kind of idea. Judas was a wolf. But he says here, I provided you the garment. How did you come without one? Well, the guy had to be speechless because he's saying, we provided one. I don't have one because I what? Here's what people do. They want to make excuses before God. And the best way to do it is just, you have no excuse. And he had nothing to offer the king. The result, though, verse 13, then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, and cast him into outer darkness. In that place there should be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like a good outcome. So invitation's gone out. And we've seen very clearly, verse 14, basically, many are called, many have the invitations. Now I say this, the world has been invited, for God so loved the world. But how many of them have accepted the invitation? Now, Calvinists use this verse. Can't use this verse, Calvinists. Sorry, it doesn't fit your doctrine in the church age. It's talking about invitees in the context. Everybody was invited. Remember, he went out the highways and byways and invited everybody. How many showed up? Only those that accepted the invitation. So look at Isaiah. Let's see. And I would say this is a good question to ask here. What side do you want to be on? So I will rejoice greatly in the Lord. My soul will exalt in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation. He has wrapped me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with garland, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. God has dressed people in his righteousness. It's called his salvation. Very poetic. How about 2 Peter 2:17? These are springs without water and mist driven out by the storm, for whom the black darkness has been reserved. Who's that? Who's Peter talking about? People that are not believers. It's been reserved for them. So we got to have two more sets of verses. Let's kind of go through them real quick, because I promise you 10 minutes, maybe 6, 7. We'll get there. Go with Matthew 24. This should be familiar. We just did this a couple of weeks ago. I didn't go intense, but I just want to put them all together here. You can see this. Now, I'm going to say there should be a principle I should have put up here. Here's the principle. I think it's horrific that people reject the Father's invitation to spend the rest of their lives in his presence. I don't know how clear to make that. So chapter 24, we're going to look at verse 51, but in context, I put up here 42, but I think probably start in verse 36, just looking, because 36 is important because no one knows the time or the hour that he comes. And basically, verse 37, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. And we went through all this where there's basically everything's normal. How many people know Christ is coming? How many people have an understanding of the return and the coming of Christ, but are unprepared and not ready and not willing, and basically having life as usual? I think these are important verses, just saying in an idiomatic way. They knew what was going on. How did they not know Noah was building this huge ship? How did they not hear his preaching? It was 120 years, it wasn't 120 minutes. Okay? And they knew this, and they still lived life as usual. And it's fascinating because what it says here, I'm just going to skip these. Okay. Never mind. Sorry, Barbara's probably too. Stop. Okay. I threw for a loop. Verse 40 and 41 but it says there were two men in the field. Again, one taken, one left. Two women grinding at a mill, one taken, and one left. Again, taken in judgment. Just like the time of Noah, when the flood waters rise, all of a sudden they said, "Oh, he was right." Verse 42 says, "There will be, therefore be on alert, for you do not know when the day of your Lord is coming." Again, reflecting back to verse 36. But verse 32, "But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at the time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you be ready, for the Son of Man is coming." It's very emphatic. Is coming in an hour you do not know. So basically, then it goes down to talking about who is faithful and sensible slave, whom his master put in charge of his household to give them all their food at a proper time. Truly, I say to you, verse 47, that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if the evil slave says in his heart, "My master is not coming for a long time," and shall be, in other words, Jesus, he's not coming again. Let me just do my thing. And the master of the slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, in an hour which he does not know. And here's what's going to happen. How many kinds of people are there so far? Two kinds of people. Okay? And this gets a little bit more violent because it's a violence. And the question is, read it literally. Don't read it literal. Because people can't be cut in pieces. But what it's saying is there'll be very much a violent time of throwing them into this place and assign them with a place with the hypocrites. Who's the hypocrites? The same place the scribes and Pharisees were condemned to in chapter 23. There will be weeping and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's it's interesting. Look at the experience of those are on the wrong side of the fence. They'll be cut in pieces. They'll be aligned or assigned a place with the hypocrites. They'll be weeping. Will be there. Notice it says will be there, and that's the same word that they translate in other places, in that place. So there'll be weeping in that place and the gnashing of teeth also. Whenever so far we've looked at this, everywhere we see weeping and gnashing teeth is judgment on those who are not believers. And that will happen at the start of the rule of Christ on earth. Can we agree on that so far as we've looked through these? Last set, and it's pretty easy because we're there right now. We're in Matthew 25, and I'm not going to, let's see where I want to go with this. What happened here? Okay, forget that. Okay, so Matthew 25, verse 30, and we're just going to turn to that in closing kind of thing. This is where we arrived today. We have just seen, in the first class, we dealt with the illustration of the 10 virgins, and these phrases again, there's only two types of people. Verse 10, we saw that there was a group ready, and they went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. In verse 11, others came and said, "Lord, Lord, open to us." He said, "I don't know you." Same thing he said in Matthew chapter 7, "I don't know you." So there was unprepared virgins, and there are prepared virgins, and we're talking about the nation of Israel. Then we're in an illustration of the talents, not the 10 talents, the talents, and we'll dissect it next week. But verse 21 says this, 25:21 says, and his master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You are faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." So what's the terminology? One group enters where? In, right? The second group, it says in verse 22, then the one who also had received 2 talents, well, this is same guy, same group, 2 talents said, "Master, you entrusted..." 2 talents came up and said, "Master, you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I have gained 2. His master said to him, same address, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." How many groups are there? Two groups. This is why math sinks, because the first group was 50-50. Now we have 66-24, kind of, or I don't know how to do 66 and 2/3 and 33 and 1/3. Then he says, and the one who has received 1 talent came up and said, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you didn't, where you scattered no seed. I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. You see what is yours. But the master answered and said, you wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you thought to have put my money in a bank, and at least on my arrival, I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has been given, they shall have abundance, but the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. There's the language, taken away, not to the rapture, into judgment. And here's the judgment. They shall be cast the worthless slave, into outer darkness. In their place there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. You see where all this is all interconnected so beautifully? And I think that's important for us to see. So here's what we've ended with this class in 7 minutes. So we've seen that Israel has seen at Christ's first advent that the most important thing for them was to accept their Messiah, but they had rejected him. And when he comes again, he will come again with an entering those into his kingdom and a judgment for those who do not enter the kingdom. And all of those will be cast into outer darkness. So you asked me, and we're going to pick up with this partially next week, probably second class. What about the rest of the world? We talked all about Israel. Well, Jesus doesn't leave them out, because it says in verse 31, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory, all the angels of heaven, all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. That's the rest of the world. So Jesus doesn't leave anybody out of the coming judgments. But as we've seen, and what I want to just make clear this morning, we've seen that phrase has to do with judgment on those who are not believers. He's only discussed all in Matthew 2 groups, 2 decisions to believe or not believe, accept Messiah, not accept Messiah, and then you'll enter into his joy. If not, you'll be cast in a furnace of fire for all of eternity. I hope that's clear, because there's a lot of confusion out there, and it annoys me. So we won't do that again. Next week, we'll pick up with Matthew chapter 25, verse 14, walk through those verses, and prayerfully finish Matthew 25 next week, maybe, possibly. How's that for? Father, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for those that were attentive to listening and prayerfully learned something this morning, and learned basically how to look at Scripture, interpret the context, understand what's being said. And more than that, your son was very definitive that there was a place for believers to enter, and that will be your glorious kingdom. And those that do not accept you, do not believe in your son, do not have a relationship with him, there'll also be a place for them that's just waiting for all of eternity for them to be in outer darkness where there was nothing but weeping and gnashing of teeth. Father, we thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen. You can be dismissed.